Katie sat on the worn leather sofa, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She had always loved the scent of fresh brew in the mornings. There was something grounding about it, something that reminded her that the world was still turning, even if her own life felt in disarray. Outside the window, the sun streamed through the trees, casting long, dappled shadows on the pavement. It was hard to believe that a few months ago, her world had been much simpler, filled with the warmth of her husband, Thomas, and the promise of their future together. She glanced around the small apartment, now a far cry from the spacious condo she had shared with him in the city. The walls were decorated with paintings she'd collected over the years, pieces she had always dreamed of filling her home with. But that dream had started to crack, piece by piece, the moment she had met Thomas's family. They were a force to be reckoned with, judgmental, sharp-tongued, and deeply entrenched in their own view of the world. Her relationship with Thomas had always been easy in the beginning, until it wasn't. He was kind, patient, and his smile was the sort that could make even the worst days seem bearable. Their connection was undeniable, and when they moved in together, everything had felt natural. But as time passed, something subtle began to shift. Katie hadn't noticed at first. It was little things, an offhand comment here, a slight glance there that made her wonder whether she truly belonged in his world. The first time Katie met Thomas's mother, Erin, she had been swept away by her warmth, her elegance, and her ability to light up a room. Erin was everything Katie had hoped for in a mother-in-law, gracious, engaging, and welcoming. But as the months passed, Katie began to notice cracks in the veneer. Erin would ask questions about Katie's finances, her family, her career. All the while, Thomas remained quiet, offering no defense, no reassurance. It was as if his silence was the norm, a way of keeping the peace, or perhaps keeping her in her place. Jenny, Thomas's sister, was another matter entirely. Where Erin wore her judgment like a cloak of gentility, Jenny was far more direct. Her barbs came quickly, almost always veiled under the guise of concern. Katie, she would say, was too dependent on Thomas, not contributing enough to the household, not pulling her weight. These comments stung. Katie worked tirelessly at a small design firm, contributing what she could, but with Thomas's wealth, she felt insignificant. It wasn't that she didn't try, it was that Thomas had made it clear from the start that he could take care of her, so she had let him. But things changed when Erin accused her of being a gold digger at their engagement party. Katie hadn't expected the confrontation. After all, they had all agreed to split the costs of the party. Thomas and her would handle the bulk of the expenses, but the rest would be shared. She was thrilled at the thought of marrying Thomas, but something in Erin's eyes that night felt off. There was a sharpness behind the warm smile she wore, a sense of calculation that Katie couldn't shake. During the evening, as Katie mingled with the guests, she noticed Erin watching her, a critical gaze that grew colder by the minute. Then, just as they were about to cut the cake, Erin took her aside, her voice a soft but firm whisper. "I don't know if you've realized, but you're taking advantage of Thomas," Erin had said, her words laced with venom. "He's worked hard for everything he has. And here you are, spending his money as if it's your right." Katie's heart skipped a beat. She had barely begun to process the words when Erin continued. "You've been financially dependent on him from the start, haven't you? You can't even pay rent without him footing the bill. I wonder what he sees in you." Katie had never been so humiliated in her life. She stood frozen, her stomach twisted into knots. She wanted to protest, to defend herself, but no words came. It wasn't just Erin's judgment, it was Thomas's silence. He had stood beside them, nodding but saying nothing. That had been the breaking point. Later, in the quiet of their shared space, Katie had confronted him. "Why didn't you say anything?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you defend me? This is your family, Thomas. Why am I the one who always has to be the bad guy?" Thomas had looked at her, his face conflicted. "I didn't want to make it worse." Katie's heart sank. "Make what worse? Your mother already thinks I'm a gold digger, and you're just standing there. You've never had my back, not once." That night, after a long, painful conversation, Katie had made a decision. Her voice, barely above a whisper, had broken through the tense silence. "I can't do this anymore, Thomas. I can't be with someone who won't stand up for me, especially when their family makes me feel small. It's over." His eyes widened in disbelief. "Katie, wait, please." But the words he had always used to calm her, to make her feel like everything would be okay, no longer held any weight. Katie didn't want to hear them anymore. "I can't stay here. Not like this. I won't." Her throat tightened as she turned away, her mind already swirling with the details of what she had to do next. The following days were a blur. Katie stayed at her mother's house, leaving Thomas's messages unanswered. She filed for divorce, something she had never imagined herself doing, especially with the prenuptial agreement she had signed. It wasn't just about the money, it was about respect, something Thomas had never shown her. His mother's words still echoed in her head. It wasn't just the lack of support. It was the implication that she wasn't enough, never had been enough. Katie couldn't reconcile that with the woman she had spent years building herself into. Her decision was made. She wouldn't be the woman she had been anymore. Katie packed her bags, leaving the life she had built with Thomas behind. She couldn't stomach the thought of staying in the same town, not with all the memories of the family gatherings, the events where she had smiled through the snide comments, the lies, and the quiet judgment. It wasn't just Thomas's betrayal that weighed on her, it was the betrayal of herself. She had let herself shrink for too long, and now it was time to grow again. Her new life began in a small town in a neighboring state. The apartment she rented was modest but full of potential, just like her. The walls were bare, but there was something inviting about the empty spaces. It was hers, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Katie threw herself into her business, a boutique design firm she had started years ago, but never had the time to nurture. She poured her energy into her work, redesigning logos, conceptualizing marketing strategies, and handling everything on her own terms. It was liberating. There was a power in solitude that she hadn't recognized before, one that allowed her to finally breathe without the weight of someone else's expectations bearing down on her. But there was also a loneliness that settled in, one she didn't expect. As the days turned to weeks, she found herself reaching for her phone, only to stop short when she saw Thomas's name lighting up the screen. His messages grew more desperate. At first, they were polite, apologetic, and pleading. But as time passed, they became more erratic. He threatened to show up at her apartment, begging for a second chance, claiming he would do whatever it took to fix things. Katie had to block him. She couldn't allow him to pull her back into that toxic world. Rumors began to surface about Thomas's life after their separation. His once impressive career had taken a nosedive. The company that had promoted him just a few months before now had him under investigation for mismanagement. His social media posts, once filled with polished photos of family gatherings and lavish vacations, now painted a picture of a man unraveling. Thomas's world was crumbling, but Katie felt no satisfaction from it. She had spent too long seeking validation from him, seeking approval from his family. Their collapse was no longer her problem. She moved on, slowly but steadily. Katie began dating again, though cautiously. She had learned hard lessons about what it meant to trust and love someone who didn't value her in the way she deserved. But she didn't rush into anything. Instead, she embraced the opportunity to learn about herself, her strength, her resilience, her ability to be content in her own skin. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of someone else's expectations. Months had passed. Katie stood before a full-length mirror in her new apartment, adjusting her blouse and checking her reflection. She looked different, stronger somehow. Her face was still the same, but her eyes held a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. The woman staring back at her was confident, independent, and no longer tethered to the shadows of her past. The woman in the mirror had shed layers of insecurity and fear, built through years of living in someone else's image. Now, she was her own. Katie's business was thriving, and for the first time she felt truly in control of her future. She had cultivated new friendships, learned to embrace her solitude without feeling lonely, and even started volunteering at a local shelter, offering her design skills to help the community. It felt good to give back, to be seen for who she truly was, not as someone defined by the wealth or status of another, but as someone with her own strengths, flaws, and ambitions. Her new relationship with herself wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and it was real. As she stood there, adjusting her hair, Katie couldn't help but feel a small pang of sadness for the life she had lost, the life she had once thought was hers. But it was fleeting. She had made the choice to leave, to move forward, and now she could see the path ahead more clearly than ever before. One evening, as Katie sat in a small cafe near her new apartment, a familiar face caught her eye across the room. It was Jenny, Thomas's sister. She hadn't seen her in months, and the sight of her stirred a mix of emotions: curiosity, surprise, and something else, something more complicated that she couldn't quite name. Jenny looked different too, less sharp and more subdued. She caught Katie's gaze and, after a moment of hesitation, walked over to her table. "Hey, Katie," Jenny said quietly, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. There was no venom in her voice, no trace of the critical edge that had once defined their interactions. Instead, there was something softer, apologetic, even. Katie raised an eyebrow but remained calm. "Jenny, this is a surprise. What are you doing here?" "I live here now," Jenny replied, her eyes darting to the table. "I moved after everything. After the divorce." Katie nodded slowly. She wasn't sure what to make of Jenny's presence, but part of her knew that this was long overdue. "I didn't know that. I'm glad you found your own place." "I guess we both had to find our own way," Jenny said, her tone uncharacteristically humble. "I was wrong about you, Katie, about everything, and I wanted to apologize." Katie blinked, taken aback. The woman before her was different. She seemed more vulnerable, more human than the Jenny she had known in the past. "You were wrong," Katie repeated, not fully understanding. Jenny nodded. "Yeah, I used to think you were. Well, I thought you were just in it for the money. For Thomas's money. But I've come to realize something. He wasn't good to you. And I should have seen it sooner. I should have been there for you, instead of judging you." The weight of Jenny's words hung in the air. Katie had never expected an apology from her, much less an admission of guilt. She had spent so much time resenting Jenny, resenting the family that had turned her into a villain in their eyes. Now, to hear these words was jarring but also healing, in a way. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Jenny added softly, "but I needed to say it. I never should have treated you that way." Katie took a deep breath, processing her words. She had carried the bitterness of the past for so long, and while it wasn't gone completely, hearing this from Jenny of all people felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Katie said after a pause, her voice steady. "But I appreciate you saying it. It means more than you realize." Jenny smiled faintly, then stood. "I'll let you get back to your evening, but I hope we can find a way to move forward, even if it's just in small steps." Katie watched her leave, the tension in her chest easing as she let the moment settle. Jenny's apology didn't change the past, but it allowed Katie to take another step toward healing. She could let go of the anger now. She didn't need it anymore. As the weeks passed, Katie continued to grow stronger. She found new confidence in herself, not just in her career but in the way she viewed the world. She met someone new, a man named Adam, who shared her love of art and quiet mornings, and while she took things slowly, she wasn't afraid of what might come. She knew now that she could love without losing herself, and that was a revelation. Katie's journey had been difficult, filled with moments of doubt and pain. But she had come out the other side a different woman. She was no longer bound by Thomas's family's expectations, nor by the constraints of a life she had never truly chosen for herself. She was free. As she sat in her apartment one evening, reflecting on the long road she had traveled, Katie realized that the life she had once dreamed of wasn't the life she wanted anymore. The dreams had changed, reshaped by the trials she had faced and the strength she had discovered within herself. And while she couldn't undo the past, she could walk forward into her future with her head held high, confident in her own worth. Her story was just beginning. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.